That's thinking about community. That's thinking about others beyond our own desires. That is finding the good within the grief. Good grief. This is a title of a workshop that a yoga studio that I'm an investor in here in Venice called Open was putting on recently about the value in processing grief in a healthy way. Such a smart company. They do so many really cool workshops, classes. It's designed so well. How you do anything is how you do everything. So just how the space is designed all the way down to the quotes that they choose for their Instagram channel, which so many of them are so Vedantic that I jot them down in my journal because they're so beautiful. Some of them even come up on the Daily Vedantic Instagram because I'm like, man, I didn't know Emerson said that. It's a really cool community. And this reorientation towards a healthy processing of grief is an exceptionally valuable one. People are grieving here in Los Angeles. Our community is grieving. I touched on our family and the impact of the fires in our lives in an episode called The Fire, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, right after it happened. And the grief has not stopped. As you can imagine, with 10,000 homes being destroyed, and the community right next to ours, and our daughter's school is in the fire. And so out of our community of friends, probably 97% of them from our 3 daughters from their school lost their homes. That's a lot of grief. That is continuing to happen all around us. And yet there's a healthy and unhealthy way to process this grief, according to Vedanta. According to this timeless philosophy, the healthiest way in one sentence is to never resist what is. Don't suppress or repress any emotions. They will just grow and become quite dysfunctional within us. Don't resist what is. Look at it clearly. Reserve judgment. We talked about that in a recent episode of Post-Determination, maybe 3 or 4 days ago. Check out that episode if you are in the midst of deep grief. But right on the outset, know that we should never resist what is. Not hide it, look away from it, repress it, see it as bad, escape from it with the bottle or the screen. See it, feel it deeply. Feel it fully. When we do that, oftentimes, especially when we can talk about it in a community of truth, when we talk about it, the problem shrinks to a fraction of the size. Why is that? It's because we're finally giving it space to just be, for us to look at it, to observe it fully. Turns out it's never as big. It's never as all-encompassing as it can often feel once we start to talk about it and give it space and stop resisting what is. So we shouldn't resist it. We shouldn't repress or shouldn't ever suppress or repress emotion, according to this philosophy. But then also in a community of truth, being able to talk about it. Such a great way to see it fully. To see what is. And lastly, the reason that I love the term good grief, that title for the workshop, is because the moments that we see as perhaps having the most grief in them at the time often become the moments of the most profound transformation we could have ever imagined in our lives. Some people can choose transformation on their own. 1 in 1,000 can do that. For the rest of us, oftentimes it takes intense pain to shift our perspective, to shift and transform ourselves. But like I touched on in a recent episode, the episode that I mentioned of post-determination, what happens when we don't resist what is, when we don't try to escape, when we don't try to bury it with this or that stimulation to try to not look at it, when we don't resist it, when we observe it fully, when we feel it fully, within weeks, months, maybe it'll take 2 years, but we start to see the value that could have only been created in that pain. One parent in the fire recently was joking that when we were consoling her for she and her husband had lost their home, she goes, we didn't love that home anyhow. And 2-3 minutes later, she said, well, we're not going to have this. Is maybe 2 weeks after the fire, maybe 3. She said, well, we know one thing, we're not going to have entitled kids. They're always going to know what we have can be taken in a moment, and to not take it for granted. What a lesson for a 5, 7, 10-year-old to have, to learn for the rest of their life. That is perspective. That is awareness beyond just what's happening right before our eyes. That's thinking about community. That's thinking about others beyond our own desires. That is finding the good within the grief. And I can only imagine this mother had been through a number of intense situations in life to where she already started to recognize, started to be aware of, or started to attune. And I can only imagine this mother and challenges, situations of grief she may have had leading up to this moment. It's training her to grieve well, to feel it fully, and to find the good even in the midst of grief. They call it, in psychology, they call it post-traumatic growth. There is post-traumatic stress, but there is also such thing as post-traumatic growth. And when we grieve well, we give ourselves the chance to see the patterns that might be right beneath the griefs within our life, patterns of growth, patterns of progress and evolution in the midst of the very things that we would have never wanted to happen. And I talk a little bit about acute trauma in an episode called The 3 A's that I highly, highly recommend checking out if you're in the midst of trauma. And this episode on grief pulled you in. If you're in the midst of acute trauma, then there's further to go. There's a bit more surgery to be done. But if you're not in the midst of acute, intense trauma and you're just perhaps in the midst of that good old-fashioned, everyday type of grief, things not going the way that we want, feeling like something's working against us, feeling like our desires are getting further and further from us instead of closer and closer. It's that kind of grief. That can be a nudge towards wisdom, towards insight, towards growth, if we can resist the temptation to resist it. That is today's reflection on the Daily Vedantic. We'll see you next time.